There's a number that should stop you cold, and that number is 105. Not 10%, not 40%, not even the 58 or 64% food inflation figures that have already been making headlines. The number is 105, representing the percentage by which bread and cereal prices have risen in Iran when you measure specific periods and specific categories of grain products. Bread, not lobster. Not wine, not a luxury item. Bread, the most basic, ancient, irreplaceable staple of human civilization. The thing that sits at the center of every Iranian dinner table, in every home from Tehran to Tabriz to Zahedan, regardless of income or class or political belief. That item, in the country of 85 million people that was once one of the most economically promising nations in the entire Middle East, has effectively doubled in price while wages have not come close to keeping up. And while this is happening, while 85 million people are doing arithmetic at the grocery store and losing, the man who controls the final word on every policy decision that has led to this catastrophe, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, is playing a different game entirely. He is playing nuclear chess. And the terrible, heartbreaking reality at the center of this story is that those two facts are not separate. They are the same story. The food crisis and the nuclear crisis are the same crisis, produced by the same choices, sustained by the same logic, and falling on the same people who had no vote in any of it. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers here are not abstractions. They are meals that are not being eaten, children who are not growing properly, workers who are calculating whether they can afford eggs this week. In September 2025, Iran's own statistical center, an institution that is widely acknowledged by independent economists to routinely minimize and underreport negative data, published figures showing food inflation had reached 58% on a year-over-year basis. That is the official figure. Labor unions and independent economists in Iran say the real number is significantly higher, and that the government's methodology consistently excludes or underweights the categories where prices are rising fastest. Even with that caveat, the official data is already catastrophic. Bread and cereal prices, according to the Statistical Center, rose by 98% in the month of May alone, which corresponds to late September through late October 2025. Fruit prices jumped 94%. Vegetables were up 77%. The economic news website Echo Iran calculated the cost of a minimal food basket, covering bread, grains, meat, dairy, oil, and sugar, and found a 63% increase compared to the previous year. A member of Iran's own parliament, Mohammad Mehdi Shahriari, stood up in the Majlis and said that current salaries, quote, do not even cover the cost of dry bread. This is not a critic of the government speaking. This is a member of the legislature of the Islamic Republic of Iran, in the parliament of the Islamic Republic of Iran, saying that workers cannot afford bread. Now, layer on top of that what has happened to wages, and you will understand why 55 million people, the number cited by regime officials themselves, are now being described as living in poverty. Iran's minimum monthly base salary for the coming fiscal year, as set out in the budget bill submitted to the Majlis on December 23, 2025, is approximately 156 million rials. For retirees, the floor is even lower, at around 140 million rials. The poverty line, according to experts and even state-affiliated media, has skyrocketed to over 550 million rials per month. The average Iranian worker's salary is approximately 170 million rials per month, which means that the average Iranian worker earns less than 1/3 of what is required simply to stay above the poverty line, not to live comfortably, not to save money, not to educate children or go on vacation or buy new clothes, just to not be in poverty, and they are earning less than 1/3 of that. 4 independent labor organizations in Iran, including the Haft-Tape Sugarcane Workers Syndicate and the Coordinating Committee to Help Form Labor Organizations, issued a joint statement in late November 2025 saying that to cover living expenses at an average level, workers need at least 600 million rials per month, which is roughly $480. The government's proposed wage increase for 2026 is 20%. That 20% increase on the existing minimum wage produces a salary of about 187 million rials. The poverty line is 550 million rials. You do not need a calculator to see the gap, but if you wanted to express it simply, the minimum wage next year will cover approximately 1/3 of the poverty line. 1/3. Let us talk about what this means in real, human, daily terms, because statistics on a page can numb you to the reality they represent. An Iranian worker earning the minimum wage in 2026, bringing home roughly 187 million rials, is earning approximately $140 per month at current exchange rates. A family of 3 in Tehran needs approximately $400 per month just to cover basic essentials: housing, food, healthcare, and transportation. That means the minimum wage earner in Iran in 2026 is covering roughly 35% of what their family needs to survive. The other 65% has to come from somewhere. It comes from a second job, from selling assets, from borrowing money, from eating less. And this is not a new emergency. The Statistical Center data shows that food prices have tripled over the past 4 years. The Iranian rial has lost 3/4 of its value in that same period. Red meat consumption per capita in Iran has fallen 40% over the past decade. Dairy consumption has fallen 30%. FAO data, meaning data from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, confirms these trends, showing that per capita calorie intake in Iran had already fallen below 2,100 calories per day by 2022, the threshold that global nutrition standards define as absolute poverty. And that was before the dramatic acceleration of 2024 and 2025. 1 kilogram of red meat, depending on type, now costs around 1 million tomans, meaning 1 million units of the Iranian currency that used to be worth fractions of a dollar and now is worth even less. A labor activist described a family that eats just 1 kilogram of red meat per month, burning through 1/4 of the average worker's entire salary on that one item. Iranian rice has, according to the state-run newspaper Ham Mihan, effectively disappeared from household tables. Rice, a food that has been central to Iranian cuisine for literally thousands of years, is now a luxury item that ordinary families can no longer regularly afford. The same newspaper reported in December 2025 that beans, which in most of the world function as the affordable protein source for working-class families, had increased in price by 255% in a single year, from 124,000 tomans to 443,000 tomans per kilogram, 255%. In 1 year, for beans, the cheapest source of protein available. Meanwhile, reports coming out of Iran's dairy sector describe milk and dairy products being returned from stores to factories, not because of spoilage or quality issues, but simply because families cannot afford to buy them. Instead, subsidized milk is being exported as industrial powdered milk to neighboring countries, because it is more profitable for Iran's sanctioned economy to sell subsidized food abroad than to feed it to the 85 million people who are going without. The state-run ILNA news agency on December 21, 2025, published a statement that should be remembered as one of the most stark admissions in the history of the Islamic Republic. It said, bluntly, "The reality is that workers no longer have a table, not a full table, not an adequate table, not a table with fewer dishes than before, no table at all." And in January 2026, Saeed Ebrahimi, a 43-year-old electrical technician and father of 2 living in Tehran, told Associated Press journalists that his wife was insisting they buy bulk amounts of beans, bread, rice, and canned food, not because prices were good, but because they needed to be prepared for uncertainty in the coming days. He added that he was not happy to be buying this much, but that with war talk filling every conversation, at the bakery, at the shop, on the street, the family had decided they needed a stockpile. And Ebrahim Momeni, a 52-year-old retired civil servant, told the same reporters, "Everywhere you go, people are talking about war. If you go to a bakery to buy bread, people are talking about war." He said the state of limbo they are living in is worse than war itself. A taxi driver summarized the sentiment with devastating precision. "Trump is bullying us," he said, to some extent. After all, he is a superpower. Wherever he points, things happen. Now understand what is happening to the currency that prices everything in this country. The Iranian rial, which in 2016 traded at approximately 34,000 to $1, has been in collapse for years. By the time the December 2025 protests erupted, the rial had hit 42 million to $1. After the internet shutdowns, the crackdown, the banking panic, and the continued U.S. military buildup, it fell to approximately 63 million to the dollar by late February 2026. To put that in perspective, the rial has lost approximately 98% of its value against the dollar since 2016. In less than a decade, the currency of a country of 85 million people has become worth less than 2 cents on the 2016 dollar. And because Iran must import substantial quantities of food, it is not self-sufficient in agriculture. Every time the rial loses value, every time the dollar strengthens against it, the cost of imported food goes up directly and immediately. The government had been maintaining a preferential exchange rate for importing essential goods, a subsidy that was keeping food prices from rising even faster than they already were. In late 2025, the Pezeshkian administration, desperate and facing a budget deficit that by some estimates had reached 40% of total budget needs, eliminated that preferential rate for everything except medicine and wheat. The consequence was immediate. Food prices surged. The banking system came under enormous pressure. One of Iran's largest banks collapsed. There was a run on financial institutions. The central bank responded by printing money. Printing money fed inflation. Inflation fed the collapse of the rial further. The rial collapsing made imports more expensive. More expensive imports fed food inflation. Food inflation drove people into the streets. And that is how December 28th, 2025 happened. It started in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran. the ancient, sprawling, emotionally resonant heart of Iranian commercial culture, the place where merchants have traded for centuries, the place that has historically been one of the most powerful constituencies in Iranian political life. The merchants of the Grand Bazaar, who had been watching their purchasing power evaporate, their customer base disappear into poverty, and their inventory costs spiral out of control, went on strike. Within days, the protest had spread to all 31 provinces of Iran, including areas that had historically been considered strongholds of regime support. The IRGC and security forces responded with lethal force. Khamenei, on January 3, 2026, said publicly that rioters must be put in their place, a statement that was interpreted by security forces as a green light for escalation. By January 8, 2026, Iran had shut down the internet and blocked international phone calls, cutting off 85 million people from communicating with the outside world. The government simultaneously announced changes to the subsidy system, the central bank governor resigned, and the regime scrambled to appear responsive to economic grievances, while simultaneously violently suppressing the people expressing them. According to the US-based human rights activists news agency, at least 490 protesters were killed and more than 10,000 arrested in the first 2 weeks. Tens of thousands more arrests followed. Families brought bodies to cemeteries and chanted death to Khamenei while clapping over the graves of people who had gone into the street because they could not afford food. And now we arrive at the other half of this equation, the part that makes the food crisis not merely a humanitarian catastrophe, but a geopolitical one. Because while Iranians were dying in the streets over the price of bread, what was Khamenei doing? He was negotiating over uranium. He was sending signals about centrifuges. He was calibrating his public statements about nuclear enrichment for maximum domestic and international impact. He was, in the truest sense of the phrase, playing chess on a different board while his own population drowned. And here's the connection that the mainstream telling of this story consistently fails to make explicit. The poverty, the food crisis, the collapsed currency, the empty tables, and the dead protesters are not separate from the nuclear program. They are the direct, documented, predictable consequence of the choices made to protect and advance that program at every cost. The economic sanctions that have destroyed Iran's currency, cut off its banking system, slashed its oil revenue, prevented it from importing agricultural inputs, and driven it to print money and collapse its own preferential exchange rate. Every one of those sanctions exists because of the nuclear program. The UN snapback sanctions that came into force in September 2025, after the UK, France, and Germany triggered the mechanism by declaring Iran in significant non-performance, with the 2015 nuclear agreement, added a fresh layer of isolation on top of an economy that was already collapsing. Those sanctions are specifically targeting nuclear and missile production. They are also, by the nature of how sanctions work, strangling the entire economy, because you cannot cut off a country's access to the international financial system and have that only affect missile factories. It affects everyone who needs to buy imported food, medicine, machinery, and raw materials. The government's own budget calculations for 2026 set wages based on a dollar exchange rate of 850,000 reals, even though the actual market rate was already 31 million rials at the time the budget was written. This means that wages were designed to lose value before they were even paid. The government knew the rial was going to fall further. It built that knowledge into the budget and gave workers a 20% raise anyway, knowing full well that 20% was less than half the inflation rate and less than a quarter of food inflation. This is not incompetence. This is a deliberate allocation of suffering. Where is the money going? The IRGC, which Khamenei described as his loyal shock force, and which controls vast sections of Iran's economy through its business empire, transferred over $1 billion to Hezbollah in the first 10 months of 2025 alone. This is while workers are bringing their unopened milk back from the store because they cannot afford it. This is while rice has disappeared from household tables. This is while 2 million students did not enroll in school last year because their families could not afford the costs. 2 million children not in school. That is not a rounding error. That is a generation being permanently scarred by poverty that was created by policy choices made by men with guns and centrifuges. The IRGC, meanwhile, has seen its budget consistently protected even as civilian agencies face cuts. A human resources manager at a petrochemical company, which is almost certainly a company with IRGC connections, earns 247 million tomans per month, which is more than 24 times the minimum wage. The top 20% of Iran's population holds 47% of national wealth. The bottom 20% holds 5%. The Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality, has risen to 40, meaning Iran's inequality level now compares to some of the most unequal societies on earth. Let us bring this all together, because this is where the chess metaphor becomes something more sinister than a metaphor. Khamenei knows what the food inflation numbers are. His government publishes them. His parliament members stand up and read them aloud. His own state media writes about the empty tables of Iranian workers. And he knows what the nuclear program costs. He knows what sanctions cost. He knows that the decision to advance enrichment beyond what any civilian nuclear program requires, to stockpile 60% enriched uranium, to rebuild the facilities that were bombed in June 2025, to say publicly on February 17, 2026, that zero enrichment is a foolish demand that he rejects. He knows that every one of those decisions is a decision to extend the sanctions, to maintain the economic isolation, to keep the rial falling, to keep food prices rising, and to keep workers without tables. He has made those decisions anyway. He makes them because, in his framework, the nuclear program is not a policy. It is the policy. It is the irreducible core of the Islamic Republic's claim to sovereign dignity. It's deterrent against regime change. It's proof that 45 years of resistance have not been in vain. In October 2025, multiple credible reports indicated that Khamenei had quietly authorized the development of miniaturized nuclear warheads for ballistic missiles. This is not a defensive deterrence posture. This is a weapons development decision made at a moment when his own population was going hungry and his own parliament members were saying salaries did not cover the cost of dry bread. In the negotiations that resumed in early 2026, mediated by Oman and conducted indirectly in Geneva, Iran's position has been consistent and has not moved. Enrichment is a sovereign right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The nuclear program will continue, and any deal must include full sanctions relief without requiring Iran to dismantle its enrichment infrastructure. Araghchi, the foreign minister, said on CBS's Face the Nation that Iran would under no circumstances ever develop a nuclear weapon, while simultaneously insisting on the country's right to enrichment at any level it chooses. These two statements are not compatible with each other. You cannot have an unrestricted enrichment program and a credible promise not to build a weapon when your stockpile is already sufficient for multiple bombs, and when your own senior advisors have publicly stated you would modify your nuclear doctrine toward weapons development if the regime faces an existential threat. And what does Trump want in return for lifting the sanctions that are causing this hunger? He wants Iran to say the secret words, as he himself described it. We will never have a nuclear weapon. He wants full dismantlement. He wants zero enrichment. He wants the stockpile shipped out of the country. He gave Iran a 10 to 15-day deadline on February 20th, 2026, backed by the largest U.S. military presence in the Middle East in over 2 decades. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is in the Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in existence, was crossing into the region. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the same platforms used in June 2025, are forward deployed. F-22 Raptors are in theater. Tomahawk missiles are loaded on 9 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. The talks in Geneva on February 26th ended after just over 3 hours. The Royale fell after the talks concluded. The Iranian parliament speaker said Iran was ready for dignified diplomacy, but also ready for a defense that would make the aggressor regret their actions. Khamenei said the U.S. was trying to negotiate away Iran's nuclear energy while pretending to be open to discussion. He has not blinked. This is the trap. And it is important to be precise about who built this trap and who was caught in it. The people caught in the trap are 85 million Iranians who cannot afford bread, cannot afford rice, cannot afford beans, cannot afford meat, who are watching their children leave school, who are seeing their milk returned to factories, who went into the streets in December and January and were killed for it. They did not build this trap. The trap was built over decades by a regime that chose to invest in a nuclear program and a regional proxy network rather than in productive, diversified economic development. It was made worse by a Trump administration decision in 2018 to tear up a working diplomatic agreement and impose maximum pressure, a strategy that made Iran's civilian population dramatically poorer while doing nothing to stop or even slow the nuclear program. It has been maintained by a supreme leader who, at 86 years old, with his own advisors warning that the economic crisis could bring down the regime, looked at his starving population and concluded that uranium enrichment was non-negotiable. And the question that nobody in Washington or Tehran or Geneva seems able to answer is, what exactly does a solution look like from here? The sanctions have done everything they were designed to do in economic terms. They have collapsed the currency, they have triggered inflation, they have emptied the tables, they have driven people into the streets, and they have produced zero nuclear concessions. None. Not one centrifuge has been dismantled under pressure. Not 1 gram of enriched uranium has been surrendered. The enrichment level has gone up, not down. The stockpile has grown, not shrunk. The facilities that were bombed have been rebuilt. A senior Iranian economist warned in November 2025 that inflation could exceed 60% by the end of the Iranian fiscal year in March 2026, and described this situation as a severe stagflation. He said hundreds of thousands of Iranians no longer earn enough to cover basic nutrition. He was not wrong. And his warning came before the December collapse, before the banking run. before the January protests and crackdown, before the February round of nuclear negotiations ended without a deal. Here is the darkest version of what the data tells us. Iran is a country where 60% of the population lives below the poverty line, according to the Middle East Forum's year-end review of 2025, where the labor force participation rate has fallen to 41%, 19 percentage points below the regional average, because so many people have simply given up looking for work, where a family needs $400 a month to survive, and the minimum wage delivers $140, where bread has nearly doubled in price and the government's response is a 20% wage increase, where 7 million people are so food insecure that they could not meet their caloric needs even if they spent every single rial they have on food, where 35 to 45% of families in the bottom half of the income distribution are now consuming fewer vegetables, less dairy, and less of every basic food category than nutrition requires, where the average per capita calorie intake has already fallen to below the absolute poverty threshold. This is a country that is quietly, systematically moving toward a hunger crisis, while the world's attention is focused on enrichment percentages and carrier strike groups. And Khamenei continues to play. He told his supporters not to protest the nuclear negotiations, but framed those negotiations as merely a delay, his word, until what he called the Islamic Shiite state is established. This is a man operating on a civilizational timescale while his population is operating on a weekly grocery budget. The parliament speaker says Iran is ready for dignified diplomacy. The foreign minister says a deal is possible, that guiding principles have been agreed, that a good text can be prepared quickly, and the supreme leader says zero enrichment is a foolish demand and invokes religious figures from 1,350 years ago to frame the confrontation as one between divine principle and corrupt foreign power. These are not the same negotiating position. They are not even the same conversation. And somewhere between those contradictory signals, a 43-year-old electrician is stockpiling beans because his wife told him to be prepared for whatever comes next, and a retired civil servant is saying that the limbo is worse than war, and a child who should be in school is not enrolled because their family hit the poverty line and could not make it to registration day. The budget for fiscal year 2026, the one that offers workers a 20% raise against a 65% inflation rate, simultaneously funds the IRGC at a protected level, sustains the nuclear program's reconstruction, and maintains the security apparatus that killed hundreds of people in the streets in January. The IRGC's business empire, which controls enormous swaths of the Iranian economy, including construction, energy, and manufacturing, operates outside the normal market constraints and extracts wealth that never reaches the working class. Over 60% of Iranian workers now hold multiple jobs in a desperate attempt to keep up with costs. The labor force participation rate has collapsed. The middle class, which shrank by about 11% each year between 2012 and 2019, has continued to shrink, with formerly stable households constantly sliding toward destitution. Between 2017 and 2024, the gap between middle-income families and the poverty threshold narrowed by 22%, meaning that millions of people who once considered themselves solidly middle class are now living one paycheck away from falling below the poverty line. This is what 105% food inflation in the grain and bread category actually means in a country. It means the number on the price tag for the most basic item on the table has doubled. It means that the family budget that was already stretched now has a hole in it that cannot be filled with a 20% wage increase. It means that the choice between paying rent and buying food is no longer hypothetical. It means that 57% of Iranians are experiencing some level of malnourishment, according to the regime's own social security organization. It means that Ebrahim Momeni's line, the weaker class of people is being crushed, is not hyperbole. It is a medical and economic diagnosis. And it means that the man playing nuclear chess in Tehran's inner sanctum, the one who says enrichment is non-negotiable and who describes the negotiations with Trump as merely a tactical delay, is making those calculations about uranium and centrifuges and sovereign dignity on top of a foundation of 85 million people who are being crushed quietly and systematically, one meal at a time. That is the 105% food inflation trap. And the people trapped in it did not choose to be there.